Segmentation is a very nifty way for a large company to organize the world around a brand. But it's bullshit and it doesn't work because the world doesn't work like segmentation does.
Hello and welcome. Thanks for listening in to Good Practice,
where we talk about what makes good creative and good business.
From Stocksy, the artist-led visual media co-op serving the creative economy, I'm Cohen, CEO.
And I'm Genevieve Ross, Creative Director, and we're your co-hosts. Season 1 of Good Practice focuses on conscious curation, the art and science of making strategic creative choices.
Curation is a practice at the heart of our day-to-day work with visual media Stocksy. So we've invited friends and collaborators, creative professionals of various stripes, to join us in conversation.
Today's episode starts with Shane Ginsberg, Chief Brand Officer at Mach 49.
So, kicking off our Good Practice podcast from Stocksy, we have with us today Shane Ginsberg, Chief Brand Officer of Mach 49. Shane, it's so wonderful to have you here. Shane is both friend and colleague, and really who I would define first and foremost as a brilliant brand guy and someone who's been very much a front runner in the digital ad industry, which you'll get kind of grok a little more when you hear what he's been up to. He has a skill set that lies at the intersection of brand, business, and creative, an unusual mix in our industry and one that I've rarely come across. But rather than cutting his teeth on Madison Avenue in the 60s, it was San Francisco in the 90s, at the birth and boon of the digital revolution, as Wired magazine, where we were both very familiar with in the early 90s, liked to call it then. Actually, it was what we called at that time, Shane, web development. Shane was co-founder of Razorfish when his web dev startup Plastic was acquired. He held leadership roles at Organic, working with Jonathan Nelson, who now heads up Omnicom IPG. He was managing director at AKQA, president of Evolution Bureau, doing incredible work along the way, and now at Mach 49 as chief brand officer. And Mach 49 was a brand I had been less familiar with. Really interesting business model in that it lives outside of the ad industry and really is a true growth machine driver that works with Fortune 1000 brands to define new venture opportunities that drive growth, essentially startups and ways that brands can kind of zig where others zag. As chief brand officer, when Shane stepped in, he really iterated on that concept, working with brands to identify and build new ventures or startups that are not only growth drivers, but really brand builders. So identifying opportunities where brands have authority or brand permission, so to speak, to play. I'm going to ask Shane to elaborate on that a bit more and I guess ask you to share more about that. You know, Shane is more than a biz guy. Shane is also an artist, which fits right in with the focus of our work. He lives with the mantra, create something every day. And he also serves as a board member of the ASU Art and Fashion Program, where he currently lives in Arizona, although very much a global citizen if you look at his flight patterns. So any course correct, Shane, on what I've shared, or maybe a bit more color about your current role? Because it's certainly very distinct what you're doing at Mach 49. And it's an evolution from the prior typical ad agency focus and roles that you've played.
Well, first of all, Trace, thanks for having me here and great to see you and Genevieve. But yeah, what I'm doing now is something completely different. And I think it's always interesting to come to a point in one's career where you've kind of understood an entire kind of framing context of an industry and then kind of just abjectly move apart from it so that you can better understand what it might be. You know, at my age, I've got the luxury of being able to step away and step back from the world that I grew up in over the last 30 years and try and find new ways to solve problems. So that's Mach 49. It's this interesting Silicon Valley company, has a couple of preconditions. You have to have founded and scaled your own business in order to work there. The job is effectively to unlock value. And how is it that you can take, as a company, the things that you do and find new ways to apply those things in the service of finding new markets, new customers, new revenue, and maybe more importantly, a renewal or a new meaning for the business that you're in. And that's very exciting to me. My insight after 30 years of working in brand is that it's the single most underleveraged asset on earth. It's also, for many companies, their only defensible asset. If you think about it, Companies can be brilliant at their supply chain and their finance. Sure, they can all do that, but their brand is the one thing that is true to them, that is uniquely theirs and is ownable by them, but is often not used in the service of anything more. The point here being is that companies spend decades and dollars building brand equity, investing in audience and awareness and all those things. And I'm most interested in how else they might capitalize on that investment in new and interesting ways, finding a new form of place in culture so that they can be of service to not just consumers as writ large, but human beings who might actually get some value in their experience of the brand themselves. And so that's been our hypothesis or our approach. And we've been working with a bunch of different companies at a global level to help them figure out how to unlock that stuff. So that's the new fun I've been having lately.
Amazing. Thanks so much. It's actually interesting because that you're here as our first guest on our Good Practice podcast, because a while back I'd given Shane a call and I said, dude, if there's one thing you should be doing, it should be a brand podcast. You're so brilliant in brand. You should have a brand podcast. And I just remember you riffing on the phone and kind of talking about, well, how, if you were to do it, which you didn't, and you just spoke about brand as being this idea of kind of brand is about how everything became something, things that you care about, things that you don't, something that you might buy, something you won't. And you're like, the moon is a brand, the French bulldog is a brand, baby naming is a brand, the avocado and its brand extension toast is a brand. And, Paris is a brand, and you just kind of go on. So you really do have this brilliant perspective on what it takes to both cultivate a brand, but essentially that everything is really a brand.
Absolutely. I think I wanted to call that podcast All Brand Flakes, which actually says maybe really rethink my naming skills. But yeah, no, it's really true. I mean, if we think of a brand simply as a promise that's made, and therefore someone's perception of something and how that can be shaped, you're right. Everything is a brand. Now, what type of brand it is and how that actually manifests in the world and how useful that manifestation is maybe the most important thing to think about. But, we sometimes just think of brands in the context of their commercial footprint. But in my world, I'm as interested in the cultural footprint of a brand as the commercial one. And then when those two things marry each other, that's where magical stuff tends to happen. But by the way, I'm not talking about advertising. Honestly, that's a hammer and a nail that has another set of applications.
So the focus of this first season of Good Practice is conscious curation. And this whole idea of essentially more signal, less noise, as we used to say back in our Wired magazine days. In fact, it was the original tagline that Jana and Lewis had for Wired magazine was more signal, less noise. Or to quote Clay Shirky, there is no information overload, only filter failure. And this is something that we've been exploring. Genevieve's just authored a paper, The Curation Paradox, on this topic. Question for you around this idea is that are there particular frameworks that you can share with us in this world of information overload that help you curate inspiration, distill insights, or find signal in the noise?
I think that it's a really interesting question because you're asking, how is it that we can organize, codify, and maybe get meaning from the incredible noisy mess, and in our case, a mess of the internet, for example. It's a near impossibility. But let me start with something that doesn't work, but something that's been used for decades, which is this idea of segmentation, which is a standard stock way that, let's say, brand owners, marketers think of the world. They think of the world through this niftily, neatly packaged and organized set of classifications around, here's a consumer type. This is what she buys. This is what she does. Here's how old she is. All those kind of basic parameters of let's call it consumer definition. And now, I get it. Segmentation is a very nifty way for a large company to organize the world around a brand. It helps you kind of figure out your media distribution, allocation, spend, your messaging, maybe even your product development. It's a nice organizing principle. but it's bullshit and it doesn't work because the world doesn't work like segmentation does. People are messy. Human beings, not consumers, human beings are inherently messy. We have different proclivities, different likes. We're a whole wealth of conflict and contradiction, and none of that stuff really can neatly fit into a categorizable box. So that's my long-winded way of saying that the way the world currently organizes itself in terms of understanding that might drive insight, I think is built on a bit of a false construct.
No, I'm fascinated by that. During this whole research period for the Curation Paradox, one of the rabbit holes that I fell into, there are many, but was about the science of categorization and the use of segmentation and categories as a way to see the world. And there's this philosophical question, can we think without categories? And the way that we're thinking about it now, that we have these tools, which is much richer and more atomized data, is that we can start seeing without these discrete categories that are discontinuous. And now we can see more dynamic frameworks. We can see patterns that we didn't actually understand, that we hadn't formalized into canons. And I know that you've been working a little bit in this realm, so I'm curious to hear more about your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and it's a really interesting kind of line of inquiry because, well, segmentation as a model ultimately kind of divides the world up into a set of audiences. And I just want to go on the record and saying, if you treat human beings as audiences, you give them the right to tune out. And after all, most brands kind of traffic in attention. So it's kind of like, it's a faulty construct, right?
Yeah.
Because at the end of that whole thing, it's like, great. So what media do we need to buy? What influencer do we need to hire? What, insert marketing tactic A, B, or C do we need to do to try and resonate with an audience? And I mean, last time I checked, we're more than just audience segments, right? We're human beings, as I said, with conflicts and the like. So when I think about how we can rethink about the world, I look at it through some very simple lenses. Number one, what do people actually give a shit about in their lives? Most of the time, it's not brands. Sometimes brands could be a proxy of their care. So, maybe I care less about Nike than I do about health and wellness or athletic performance, or in some instances, looking cool on the street. But Nike is really just a proxy of that interest or that care. The second thing that I think about is, what is the unmet need that I might have that maybe could be satiated by a brand or a product or a service? And then I think, that all rolls up into kind of an interesting and new idea, which is that of anticipation. I believe that it is the role and actually the function of some of the best brands on earth are effectively in the anticipation business. They build very complex models and programs to figure out how someone might want to do something, what unmet need might be filled. So if I think of maybe, let's just say three amazing examples of really potent and powerful brands and services, Netflix, Amazon, and Google. Let's pull those three.
Sure.
Because, they're considered exceptional, right? Well, if you think about it, Netflix has built its entire kind of construct, its model, its everything, anticipating how you might want to waste the next 2 hours of your life. And then serving you kind of the appropriate kind of experience / content that satiates that need, that desire. Amazon, spent probably, I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars anticipating what you might want next at your doorstep, and then built an entire model in that. And certainly Google's existing business model is anticipating what you might be interested in, and then meeting that curiosity with a set of information and services. Those are maybe easy examples, but I think when we think of the world through the lens of anticipation and unmet need, it unlocks a whole bunch of opportunities for artists, for creators, for obviously brands to really play a more active role in being of service to those needs.
I'm curious about, we talk about audiences, and more people are framing audiences as communities. And then there's this conversation around what is a community? Like, what differentiates a community from just a whole group of people who like the same shoe. And how big can a community be until it's not a distinct group with a shared set of values? And obviously in the past we've had much more of a concrete idea of what community is and what it serves that are more institutionalized in our lifestyles, whether that's like school or church. And now a lot of community is intangible and it gets chaotic and messy in this brand internet space. Trace, you're talking about how Facebook, it might be, a post from a news outlet on something terrible that's happened, and then something else that's trying to sell you socks. And it's like a friend of yours had a baby. And so
just like context switching the whole time. I mean, nobody really addresses this context switching conundrum. It's actually frightening. We talk about having attention deficit disorder, but to literally talk about categorization, the fact that nothing is categorized and that you're getting a post of, you're looking at some rubble and children that have just been blasted in Gaza. Then you're seeing an ad for a face cream, an anti-aging face cream. And then you're seeing like how to plant cilantro in the winter. It just makes no fucking sense.
But I think that's a logical conclusion of...
I thought you were going to say that that was a logical flow of information.
Of our current kind of commercial and technical infrastructure has been structured to treat communities as audience. And so therefore, it's going to serve you what it might think is an ad for X, Y, or Z against a certain interest set. Again, my definition of community might be vastly different than, let's say, Mark Zuckerberg's. Because the most important thing to learn isn't like, oh, great, how do we monetize community behavior? Because it's kind of really, I think, a very shallow way to look at the world. Definition of community, from my perspective, is one that I think is held for maybe millennia, which is how humans organize and gather themselves around things of interest and need. And those things could be trivial, like my particular love of hardcore German techno, which I do have, but I prefer French disco, be something as, let's say, more easily and well understood, which is maybe a community built around faith or spirituality, right? Mm-hmm. Some of these things are big, some of these things are small. But to Trace's point, they're all important to me at a certain particular point in time. Now that changes, though. The internet is this big messy thing, and arguably, every human being is a node on the network and stuff, and it reconfigures itself all the time. The reality is brands aren't in that. They're on top of it. They have a layer and a whole bunch of ad tech that helps them try and mine whatever those things are. But you got to be in it to really do it, not on it to try and monetize it, right? So what we did at Mach 49 is we started by looking at 50,000 communities of interest, maybe ranging from hardcore German techno all the way through to yoga and everything in between, let's say, and started to try and find and codify signals. Where are there, let's call them non-obvious, non-trivial connections between various communities of interest? What are the common themes and bonds? What are the united need states that maybe people in skateboarding and people in yoga might share? And that really creates kind of a very different and really interesting model of the world, because we're able to then map those signals against unmet needs. Mm-hmm. And there was a bunch of cool research that was done over at USC about 161 dimensions of human need, interest, and behavior. And so we applied a matrix of that over these billions of conversations that are happening on the internet on a daily basis, so that we could really find useful signal around what people really give a shit about and how they basically manifest that care.
Yeah.
To me, that's been really fascinating.
It's like, what's that quote from David Ogilvy? Something about the trouble with market research is that people don't know what they feel, and they don't say what they think, and they don't do what they say. So when you're looking at data, there's the whole concept of the semantic gap that describes the challenge of translating human I was more interested in it from the angle that there's this difficulty or this gap where you can't really translate human aesthetic experience into machine readable data. And we don't yet have like an algorithm that genuinely understands meaning, that they rely on a certain set of heuristics and struggles with subjectivity.
It does.
But then we are needing to use data to better understand like meaningful human attention and needs. So, when you're looking at community and you're looking at the shape of community and you're actually creating models and you're looking at distance and you're creating those ways of understanding the density and the strength of communities, I find fascinating.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I don't care that much about is size. And I know that, look, marketers live and die by total addressable market, right? But I think that's a very facile kind of approach to this world. I'm most interested in, as you said, density. Let's call that a proxy for intensity, right? Like, how active is this thing? Because a small, highly dense community has a network effect that is significantly more powerful than just a large group of people who are loosely interested in baseball. But a small group of people who are vehemently interested in the outcome of the next Chicago White Sox game, I'm just making that up, is absolutely more powerful and actually maybe a more harnessable energy for insight and for inspiration and even for commercial application. The other thing is, I think you can tell a lot more what people do, like how they behave and what they're actually talking about with each other, rather than what, let's say, a company or a brand might ask them. So our approach is really to observe their behavior and their interest and the density and velocity of that interest set to then infer those need states. So then we can maybe figure out developing products and services that meet those need states, rather than focus grouping them to find out whether they might indeed want to buy a car or a horse, right?
It's really interesting when you were talking, Shane, about the two models, right? At the end of the day, we are talking about marketing, right? We're talking about how to reach communities in this context. I think when you talk about attention and anticipation, one of the things I think has kind of been the sort of royal fuck up of the community industry, so to speak. And in some ways it happened when community became what was social media. So
Yes.
Shane, you'll remember back in the day, late 90s, I founded a company called Shop Talk, which was all about brand community. And we were ASP hosting communities. We integrated, 30, 40, 50 sites, everything from Sega to cooking.com to Petco to even Razorfish. We were part of the mom community, right? So it was all these communities of interest that were integrated onto a brand site. And the whole idea that if you were on cooking.com and you were talking about baking, now you had a whole community. And then 2001 happened, and suddenly all these brands that had built community, very much off the model of early bulletin boards and the well, and kind of even the sort of MySpace world in some ways, were essentially duped into believing that their spaces were no longer the place to host community, and that they needed to migrate their community to Facebook and Twitter, right? So basically all of these brands that had built these amazing communities over the kind of early .com era then took all their people, and it just became SSO and log into your kind of, Facebook. We no longer had community. And then a year later had to pay millions of dollars to then be able to reach the exact community, grab back the attention or the anticipation of that community. I really wonder what would have happened had that not happened, right? And if brands actually had ownership, and we would be living in less of this kind of attention deficit space where conversations could be focused and communities could have blossomed or burgeoned. There's certainly another way to say it, which is like, okay, you can't necessarily own the domain, and conversation is distributed and happens where it happens. So the idea that it would always be nested within a brand kind of context is limiting in itself, but it certainly was the kind of royal bait and switch.
It certainly is. I think pretty provocative, but I think you used a word there, Trace, that I think is the word, which is ownership. And the question is, who owns the community? I'm not sure brands have today the right or the play to own a community. And I'm certain of it that, let's call it the social media platforms have no rights either. I mean, I think the world's best communities are self-created, self-owned, self-controlled, and they very rarely revolve around a brand. There's an interesting thing. In the world of brand, according to every brand in the world revolves around them. But the most interesting and vibrant communities don't happen at a top level of an own brand TikTok post. But interesting stuff happens in the comments. The most interesting insights and the most interesting kind of activity, and I would call it density, happens on a subreddit somewhere that has nothing necessarily just to do with a brand, but has everything maybe to do with what a brand might represent. Let's use fashion. Where am I going to find more inspiration, insight, kind of say meaningfully deep conversation? At a subreddit that's built around sustainability in fashion, or on the Stella McCartney brand forum? I'm certain I'll find it in that subreddit because it's unpoliced and it's a little bit less structured, but therefore I think more interesting if we can pull actual meaningful insights on signal. Genevieve, to your point, how can we take all that energy and not bottle it, but rather better understand it so that we can feed that energy, not extract that energy, which is typically most communities are considered extractable assets for a brand to mine versus actually looking at them as a source of power for something net new. I believe communities are a source of truth and opportunity, but you've got to figure out how to see them. Yeah.
They're kind of referred to as like a property, like a brand property.
And I think that's kind of what you're saying about the ownership thing. Like there is no such thing. Totally get that.
Yeah.
But what's also interesting is, you build communities around a certain set of values, and with this sort of sublimated understanding that there is a reciprocity there. Otherwise, there is some give and take. Yeah. And even though there's no, to your point about size, like there's no established metric for a healthy community except for the bonds between individual members and how active it is at that level.
Yeah, that's 100% right. You could argue that any one of these activities, and actually arguably most brands, are predicated on an emotional transaction. It's a clumsy way of saying something, but basically there is some form of value exchange. Now, for most human beings, the motivators are really simple. There are only four human motivators: what? Hope, fear, greed, and vanity. And somehow, if you get more than one or two of those things, you can have a really active kind of exchange. And those are emotional exchanges. But then what happens is that, especially in the world of brand, we have these emotional transactions, but then what we have are a series of intellectual alibis that then justify that emotional exchange, right? Brands are really good at articulating the intellectual alibis, reasons to believe, propositions and feature benefits and all that stuff. But it has bugger all to do with why people actually engage with things. The type of car I drive, I can create an intellectual alibi that says, well, it doesn't use any gasoline. So therefore, but really the emotional transaction, the emotional rationale is because it's not because I just want to do better, I want to do better for the planet, but I want to signal to the world that I actually give a shit about the fate of the planet. I'm not sure if my car purchase is going to do anything for that, but maybe that's another podcast.
It's funny you mention that because I have a Tesla. And I used to enjoy what it signifies, and now I just feel like an asshole. So.
That's very true. There's a huge subculture now. I think it's LA based. It's a community born thing of the various bumper stickers that you can now put on your Tesla to
look into that.
To mitigate the fact that, Elon Musk, right? If we ever want to talk about the power of brand and therefore, and how brand interacts with community. Tesla's probably the world's greatest case study.
Yeah.
Because it's a brand that was built on no marketing.
Yeah.
It was built on the sense of tribal identity and belonging. In this case, where they, let's call it a provocative and interesting cult leader on the top of it. Let's just say that. But if you look at that, how that brand was basically born and built of some form of sense of communal belonging. But, you live by that sword, you die by that sword.
Shane, at our Visual Insights webinar, when you were speaking, you shared the concept, if brands ignore culture, culture will ignore a brand. And just curious, and maybe the Tesla example is one, but just thoughts on a recent example and maybe kind of what lesson we might draw from it. Super curious about that.
I've been thinking about this one a lot because we no longer have any semblance of a monolithic culture. So then the question becomes, which culture? Right? And there is no such thing anymore as the culture. It's a whole series of kind of fractured, call them communities of interest that then manifest themselves as cultural entities. You could argue that maybe the culture of environmentalism and sustainability, which has actually been a very, very strong underlying, call it premise for many brands over the last 10 years, some of it's greenwashing, but some of it might be sincere and real, has absolutely, you could say that Tesla in its current iteration, or at least its current political proposition, has walked away or at least ignored that particular culture with meaningful consequence, at least in terms of what we can see from a sales perspective, let alone the cultural imprint and footprint of people putting bumper stickers on their Teslas, right? But I think inside of that idea of ignoring culture and therefore culture ignoring brand, I think it's incumbent on every brand to think about which culture and how they can meaningfully participate in their culture and add value to it. And I think that's where shit just falls apart very quickly.
It's almost interchangeable with community the more I think about it, right? Culture and community. I mean, even if you look in that quote, if brands ignore communities, communities will ignore a brand.
100%. And what are communities? But basically collections of people that subscribe to a particular cultural sensibility. Often, not always, because there are conflicts and contradictions in that too, like there are in everything. But it's a fair guess or a fair assumption to make that people who gather around a particular point of interest might often share a particular sensibility, which then translates into their consumption behaviors, but also maybe their value sets that they subscribe to. And that, by definition, then turns into culture.
Just bringing it back, and Shane, as we wrap up for today, the focus of this podcast is conscious curation. You're a person I often turn to for curation. As you know, you've gotten texts from me asking what you're reading or what's of interest right now. Can you share with our, not going to say the word audience, people who might be hanging out with us right now, any recent inspirations? Be it a book, be it an art, be it an experience, something to check out.
Yeah, mostly what's inspiring me is, again, I think it's pretty trite, but the travels. And I travel 6 months of the year. And increasingly, I've been spending time down in different parts of South America. I've been greatly inspired lately by my travels to Chile, partly because this is a country that went through a brutal dictatorship in 1973, the year I was born, and a certain kind of regime that could be termed somewhat fascist. It was also the kind of an experiment of free market capitalism that hadn't been done anywhere else in the world. There was also some interesting things that happened. Chilean culture and society is relatively conservative compared to the rest of South America, but went through a revolution a few years ago, a relatively quiet revolution as well. And what's really interesting to me is to see countries and cultures and societies and communities that have emerged from kind of weird, anomalous dislocation and disruption and what's happened. And gotten to become very friendly with a bunch of artists and creators, musicians, winemakers out there who really, they get to almost like build a new model version of society, from a very different frame of reference. This happened in Spain after Franco. It happened in various other countries, but it's just been really inspiring to spend time down there with people who look at the world very differently than we might do here in North America, but bring a perspective that I think is very kind of instructive for us to learn from, having lived through extreme degrees of totalitarianism, reconciliation, reinvention, a bit of revolution. And I think, honestly, we're no longer here in the States as exceptional as we've ever thought we were. And I think we can learn a lot from countries that, have been a little overlooked and underestimated. So that's really what's inspiring me these days.
Thanks for kicking us off on this Good Practice podcast, Shane. It's been awesome and allowing us to both hone in and focus, and at the same time also ricochet all over the place and talk about how we more consciously curate and navigate these lives in a world that's become increasingly tricky to navigate. You're brilliant. You're awesome. Thank you for the space. Thank you for the listening. Thank you for the conversation. Genevieve, this has been swell, and we'll chat to you later.
It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. We hope you'll follow along or subscribe to Good Practice. Season 1 continues with Kristen Nyman of The Real Real.
Good Practice is brought to you by Stocksy, the internet's first and only artist-owned cooperative stock media agency.